Progress.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I apologize for being a little bit late. I hope that gave you time to eat a little bit, maybe before the festivities get underway. But welcome to the sixth session of this spring's Education Policy Colloquium Series, sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance here at Kennedy School. My name is Jim Pizer, and I'm pleased to be your host today. Working alongside PEPG's leaders, Paul Peterson and Marty West. Marty is here with us today. And as most of you know, we meet every Thursday at noon here in Taubman, and we'll be meeting through most of April. So hopefully you'll be able to come back and see us again, whether you're here in person or online. Our next meeting next Thursday will feature Pierre Lucien, who is a doctoral candidate at Oxford University and formerly a research analyst here at Harvard. Who'll be sharing his research on the impact of high school, early college, and early career pathway programs, primarily in Massachusetts. Where he's done research previously for the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. So I hope you can join us next week, next Thursday here at noon for that one. Today's topic is the connection between educational achievement and long-term economic growth, featuring one of the leading scholars in the field, Dr. Ludger Woessmann, who is here with us today, and who has done quite a bit of work in this field on his own, but also in partnership with a PEPG friend, Rick Hanishin. Given the post-COVID decline in most measures of student achievement, especially here in the United States, which was a laggard already on most international measures, there's reason to believe that today's educational crisis may lead to dire economic consequences in the future. I'm assured that Dr. Woessmann will provide us with some practical strategies for how we might address some of that, so it may not all be doom and gloom, although Ludger, I don't know if I can promise anything about how optimistic this session will be. Nonetheless, there are deep challenges that confront us and demand action and urgency on our part to address them. Dr. Ludger Woessmann is the professor of economics at the University of Munich. He's also director of the IFO Center for the Economics of Education. He's also a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And he is currently a visiting global fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. After Ludger's presentation, we'll have ample time for questions and answers and dialogue and discussion. We'll also give priority to folks here in the room, but we'll try to integrate folks who are watching online through Zoom. So if you are watching online, please enter any questions or comments you might have in the chat, and we'll try to pull you into the conversation before the hour or the hour plus is done. It obviously, as you can tell by the fact that we are on Zoom, and I think you probably already got the notice this is being recorded, that this is actually being recorded. We'll post it online on the website after we're done. So everything that is said here today is effectively on the record. We will also, I think to the extent there are questions that folks have during the course of the presentation, clarifying questions, I think it's okay for folks to feel free to ask. But otherwise, try to hold questions and comments till Ludger's presentation is done. And with that, it's my privilege to turn it over to Dr. Ludger Woessmann.
Great.
Welcome.
Thanks, Jim. Very nice. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I was wondering a little bit on what exactly to talk about here and how deeply to go into one thing or give a broader overview. I decided it's probably going to be fun to give a few snapshots of work that we've been doing on the international comparative basis, comparing different countries in particular, and then really just give you a couple of ideas here that we've been doing, and then we're gonna hopefully have ample time to discuss those things that interest you the most. The background, as you heard, is the economics of education. So I'm really interested in how education relates to our economic prosperity, both as nations and as individuals. And I'm going to start out with that. So what are the consequences of educational achievement at the national and individual level? Then also talk a little bit about what we already heard about trends in student achievement of the US in these international comparative tests. And then, of course, because probably not a big surprise, I'm going to show you that educational achievement is super important for economic prosperity, we also wonder what we can do to make sure that everybody gets a decent education. And so I'm going to talk about a few things there as well. I mean, one could easily talk about each of these things for 2 hours, I think. But let me get you these spotlights and then see what we want to discuss in depth. So let me start out with the importance of education for countries' economic performance. When people started out to look at this empirically, so the basic idea is like the people get an education, they learn math, science, whatever. These gets you the skills that make you productive in the economy. And so as a country as well, your like how well you're doing economically may depend to some extent on the skills that your population have accumulated. And that's traditionally been called the human capital because it's investments in the sense that education is something that you actually have to do first. It costs a lot of money, effort, and time. And the hope is that in the long run, it may pay off because it makes people more productive, but also additionally lead to the fact that people start creating more ideas, get more innovation, we get technological advancements, and therefore become richer because we can transform given inputs into more economic output. And so when people started looking at that, the idea was like, how can we measure the human capital of different countries? And so with a lot of effort, they combined measures that basically count the number of years of schooling that on average people have in different countries. And so what we can then do is we can look at how these years of schooling, that's what you see here, are associated with the long run economic growth rate. So this is the average annual rate of economic growth of real GDP per capita of the different countries, and each indicator there is one country. This is about a very long run perspective. It's 1960 to 2000. You can actually expand that and looks very, very similar. And what you see overall there is, yes, that on average, countries that actually have more years of schooling tend to grow faster, but it's also the case that most countries are like far off of this line. So it's not that you can fully explain differences in growth rates of countries in the long run. In fact, like such a simple model would account for about a quarter of the differences in long run growth rates of different countries. But now the main problem with this here probably is that, as we know from these international achievement tests that I'm going to talk a bit more about later, is that people in some countries learn much more during 1 year of schooling than people in other countries. So it's just about the quality of the school systems and how much you learn there. And at the end of the day, as I was indicating, we're probably more interested in not how much time you spend in school, but what you've actually learned. And so what we did there is thing like there are these international student achievement tests, and we're going to focus on math and science mostly because that's probably most easily measured across countries in a comparable way. And they've been starting out in the 1960s and going on in the 70s, 80s. And so we try to combine all these tests to get one measure of what students in the different countries have actually learned. And we're going to use that as our alternative measure for, and we'd like to call this the knowledge capital, just emphasizing that human capital is not just about spending time in school, but really about knowing or being able to do something. It's really the skills that people have accumulated. And when you do that, you see this picture. So we just have these test scores in math and science in the older international achievement tests, again, against the same growth rate of the economy. And what you see now, all countries are like, there's a strong positive association and all countries are very close to this line. So literally there's no country whatsoever where the population has gotten a great education and they have gotten a slow growth rate. And there's no country where people didn't get a good education and like in the long run, the economy would have been growing fast. So it's really that with this simple model, you can account for more than 3/4 of the long run differences in economic growth rates across countries. So if you want to understand why some countries have gotten rich in the long run and others have stayed poor, the education of the population is a first order factor to go to understand that. These are correlations. We did a lot of work that at least convince ourselves that what you see here is mostly really a causal effect of better achievement of the population causing more productivity and then getting higher long-run growth rates. Maybe you'd like to zoom in onto one specific aspect at this global scale. Let me spend a couple of more minutes focusing in onto these pictures and figuring out two big regions in the world. The one is East Asia and the other one is Latin America. So if you would zoom back into 1960, Latin America's GDP per capita was actually twice as high as the one of East Asian countries on average. And at the time, probably no one would have predicted that East Asia is the region that really took off in the long run and Latin America didn't go anywhere. Actually, the years of schooling that they had were very similar at the time. Today, this GDP per capita ratio is actually reversed. By now, Latin America is East Asia is twice as rich as Latin America on average in terms of GDP per capita. What this means is that people in East Asia today are on average 9 times as prosperous as 2 generations ago. So they are basically 9 times as rich as their grandparents. So their grandparents were very poor rice farmers who could hardly make a living. But today, that's just if you go into many of these countries, look around, it just looks in terms of prosperity similar to what you see outside the window here. And that's quite different in Latin America. Also, there people are much richer than their grandparents, but it's only a factor of 2.5. And I think this is the most fundamental type of questions as economists we would like to answer and understand. So why is it that some countries got rich and others stayed poor? And this is exactly what's behind the growth rates we were just looking at. Because you might think about, so why do you care about a growth rate of 2% or 4%? But if you do such a growth rate difference for 50 years, this is exactly what you get. Because your growth rates, for 50 years, you either are 9 times as rich or you're just 2.5 times as rich. Now, let's look at the same picture again that we started out with. Here's years of schooling, here's the growth rates, and just figuring out countries in these two regions. So red are all the countries in Latin America, and black are all the countries in East Asia, and the blue dots are all the other countries. And what you see, the question is, to what extent can we explain growth rate differences between these two regions of the world by differences in years of schooling? I mean, basically not at all. I mean, all the Latin American countries are below the line here, and all the East Asian countries are above the line. You don't explain at all with this model why the difference is in there. So how can that be? What's behind there? Let's look at how these years of schooling actually relate to our test score measure. This is again the same scatter plot of countries, and you see on average, countries that have more years of schooling also tend to have higher quality education and perform better. Or if you look at it this way, you see that literally kids in all the Latin American countries perform worse, have worse actually student outcomes, as you would expect based on their years of schooling, and exactly the opposite is true. Or students on average in all these East Asian countries do better than you would expect based on their years of schooling. And so it's really what you see is there's hardly any difference in terms of how long they went to school, but the real difference is there that for each year of schooling, students in Latin America in countries have learned much less than students in East Asia. And now if you take this test score measure again, looking at the same picture as before, test scores against economic growth, you actually see they all fall along the same line. There's really no puzzle why Latin America didn't grow. There's really no miracle why East Asia was growing. As soon as you take into account the educational achievement of the population, it's just like these countries here, like Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, just what you would predict from all other countries is they grow that fast because they were just doing very well in terms of the population's education. And the same is true on the other extreme for most of the Latin American countries like Ecuador, Peru, Paraguay. Most of these are at the lower end here. And so in a simple model like this, you literally account for 100% of the growth rate differences and long run prosperity differences between East Asia and Latin America just by accounting for the educational achievement of the population. And that's why I think this is so super important for our long run prosperity. Let me quickly skip that because I see otherwise I'm going to run quickly out of time. If you want to go to this global perspective, we may come back to this and see how different countries are doing these days. What's maybe a bit closer to everybody's heart, maybe like how, to what extent actually educational achievement is relevant for your individual achievement on the labor market as well. And so there's another very interesting international testing program. It's called PIAC, and that's similar, like basically it's like an adult achievement test. It's like an adult PISA. PISA is one of these international student achievement tests. And it's again representative samples of adults now in all these participating countries taking a literacy and a numeracy test, and then you can directly link how they are doing to like their earnings on the labor market. And what you get there is here, or what I'm showing here is basically the return to numeracy skills on the labor market in a way where like these test scores are measured basically on a scale that has 5 separate steps. And what I'm showing you here is like each step on this 5-step test is related to X% higher earnings on the labor market. And what you see is in all the countries that participated, it's systematically the case that people who do better on these numeracy tests earn higher wages on the labor market. And the US is among the countries where actually the returns to these skills is the highest among participating countries. So here's more than like each of these steps on the test score ladder relates to 25%, more than 25% higher earnings in the labor market. Internationally average is about 18%. But even countries that actually have very like much more equal earnings overall, like the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, the returns are actually much lower, which is mostly because wages are much more compressed in these countries. But still, there's a huge return in literally any country we can look at in terms of making higher wages if you've got higher earnings. That's why we care about these achievement tests as an economist. Probably other reasons why you want to care about that as well. So what is the current state, or like how has the US been doing on these tests over time? Here's a picture from the TIMSS test. So TIMSS is one of these international student achievement tests that tests 8th grade students in each country in math and in science. So it's a representative sample. And what you see, I mean, it started out in 1995. They do it every 4 years. And there was actually a pretty consistent increase in the US achievement on these tests until 2015, and it flattened out. And it really fell off a cliff, like during the period when we had the COVID pandemic. You probably know this picture very similarly from the NAEP, your national achievement test. Is really there. I think is again, I heard people interpreting it like we basically had seen a 30-year increase in math achievement that was totally like lost within this period of time. It's exactly what you see here. The pattern is not as strong in science, but also there we actually in the past 8 years see a downward trend as well. You can look at PISA as another test that the picture looks slightly different there in some dimensions, but also on math, you see a strong downward trend. That's actually much, and the US is actually pretty much below the OECD average, which is the average of the rich, like developed countries club. So it's not even like the US is nowhere close to the international top performing countries. And in math, at least, it's literally substantially below. Trends in reading were actually a bit better, and in science as well in the PISA test. And so that now is the question, like, what can these international comparisons tell us about what is relevant for achieving high skills on these tests, doing these tests? And I guess the first thing that everybody would like jump to is like, okay, it's going to be spending. You're going to just spend more on education in different school systems, and that's going to make sure that kids are learning more. Problem is that that's really not very much the case. I mean, if you would compare rich countries to very poor countries, you would of course see that there's differences in spending there, but of course there's many other differences as well. But if you just stick within country, like this is just countries from the European Union, so we have a similar group of countries. Here's the expenditure per student that each country spends on students on average until they're 15 years old, because this is the PISA test, and the PISA test tests representative samples of 15-year-olds in each country, and there's basically no associations whatsoever, and you can draw it in different samples. Actually, this is a very consistent pattern. It's just not the case that countries that spend more on education would do systematically better in terms of the performance of their students. That doesn't mean that spending in specific situations and in many areas is irrelevant, but it tells you that the first order reason why some countries do better than others is not going to be spending level. You can, I mean, this was just like a scatter plot, like with these tests. By now you can look at changes, longer run changes in spending per student and changes in your PISA scores, and not even there is the case. So you take out levels between the different countries, just look at whether countries that have expanded their spending more than others would have seen larger increases in their students' achievement. And again, that's just not at all the case. So what is it then that could account for differences in student achievement across countries? And these are really big differences out there. So there's some indication that what's really an important factor is not how much you spend, but how you spend the money, and that's related to the incentives that are out there in the school systems to do a good job, and these are to quite some extent kind of formulated by the different institutional structures that different school systems have. By that I mean things like examination systems or accountability systems, or to what extent schools have autonomy, maybe also the extent to which parents have choice across different schools. And so two important aspects that we see in these data is really this combination of testing and autonomy. And like a very simple picture to give you a first order idea of this. So what we are now doing is we're taking these student achievement tests. This is from the TIMSS, but you could do the same for the PISA, and literally have data for, I think in this specific study, like 250,000 students that participated in this from all these different countries, have that at the individual level. And so we can take out differences in student achievement that are there because of like their family background or migration background, or things like how much spending there is and class sizes, and then add as potential explanatory factors. He has examined two main features of these institutional structures. The one is whether countries have central exit exams or not. So this is something that many countries have, in the sense that when you want to graduate high school, you have to take a standardized exams that all students have to take, and you have to pass it to graduate. This means two things. The one thing is that students themselves actually have to do reasonably well to graduate. The other thing is you have transparency on how different students, how different schools are doing, and policymakers can use that. In some countries, it's even like publicized, and then the general public can look at that. And that means you have the information, the transparency on how different schools and students are doing. That is really the basis for any action, and will by itself just create incentives to make sure that you're not looking bad. So that's the idea between countries that do not have central exit exams and that have central exit exams. And vertically, I'm putting up now how students are, after accounting for all the other impact factors, are doing in these countries. And what you see clearly on average is that countries that have central exit exams, students do much better than in countries that don't have that. But there's a second aspect in here, and this has to do with the autonomy of schools. That's meaning like how much responsibility or how much freedom schools themselves have. Here's a specific example of school autonomy over teacher salaries, meaning that they can actually address parts of the teacher salaries as one example of an area where you could have autonomy or not. And so we know from the data, from the background questionnaires in these schools, whether schools actually have some of this autonomy or not. And now what you basically see is that in countries without central exam systems is actually schools that have autonomy perform worse on average than schools that do not have autonomy. Now, if you go to countries with central exams, the one thing is, on average, the achievement is much higher, but also these association of student achievement with school autonomy turns around to be positive, meaning if and only if you have some sort of accountability by the central exams, then it's actually the case that schools do much better if they have autonomy to try to find the best way of how students can do well on these exams. So the idea is a little bit that if you've got autonomy but no accountability, then schools can use their freedom for anything, but they're like opportunistically, because no one will ever observe whether students actually do better. Whereas once you have this transparency about outcomes, it seems that actually the effect of autonomy turns around into a positive one, because then there's all the incentives there to do well. And then it seems that schools themselves know much better than any central planner on how best to improve the achievement of your students. So that's the overall story of like broad aspects that are very relevant for student outcomes internationally. It's this testing, central exams, and it's school autonomy. So we have done much more work on these aspects more recently, just to give you like a quick idea of what we've been doing more recently. With these PISA scores, you actually have like 20 years of test score data, and so you can look at variations over time, and that for just like identifying effects gives you much more power, because you don't just have to compare across countries in the way I just showed you and hope that you observe everything else that's relevant for student outcomes, but you can just take out any differences in overall levels across different countries, because they may be there for many other reasons, and just look at whether schools that actually have increased, for example, the use of standardized external comparisons, whether student achievement increased or decreased systematically relative to other countries. And that's what we're seeing here. This is like the change in the share of schools that actually use standardized external comparisons. Like one of these, an example of this are these central exit exams, but it's also any standardized use of testing in the school system. And what you see is that countries that did increase this saw much bigger increases in their PISA score, as opposed to countries that didn't increase or even lowered the use of standardized testing. And we see a similar, this is a standardized external comparisons as one form of testing. We totally look at 4 different forms of testing. A second one is standardized internal testing. And for that, we actually also saw a very similar effect, actually, particularly for countries that initially have a very low achievement. So both these effects of standardized testing are much bigger in initially low achieving countries compared to high achieving countries. High achieving countries that already do very well apparently don't need too much of these standardized testing. But then other forms of testing, like just simple internal testing and school inspectorates or heads of schools observing teacher lessons. So these different forms of internal testing, we literally see no effect whatsoever. And particular forms of teacher testing, if anything, we see in very high achieving countries may even have negative effects, but overall in most countries, we don't see effects. So it really seems like these standardized testing is something that creates the transparency that is foundation for better outcomes. We can do a similar analysis of school autonomy of changes over time. And here again, we see these positive effects, but actually only, I mean, the one thing is the interaction with exit exams. So school autonomy has much more positive effects when there's exit exams. The other thing is actually these autonomy effects are much more positive in richer countries, more developed countries overall. And they can literally even turn negative in basically in settings where there's probably less capacity for schools actually to use their freedom. Okay, let me give you two more insights from our research more recently that go a little bit outside these international testing. And that's because like we now talked a little, like quite a bit about what are factors within schools that are relevant for how much skills people accumulate. And we know from research everywhere is that like one very important additional influence factor of student achievement is what families are doing. And so that's basically there's these huge inequalities for children from better off and worse off family backgrounds. And what we literally see actually on the TIMSS and PISA that I didn't like go into is the decrease in math skills in the US is actually much stronger for more disadvantaged students than for higher, like better off students. So you see like there's actually a decrease for all groups, but it's much stronger for disadvantaged groups. And so here the big question then is like what you can do. And so one of the insights from the economics of education or education research more generally is that early interventions, early childhood interventions can be very successful, particularly for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. But so what can you do when these kids are already adolescents, and this is basically the end of what society or policymakers could do. And so one program on policy, one intervention that people have come up with to try to help disadvantaged children are mentoring programs. So the idea is there's like, I think, so how I like to interpret this is, okay, what these kids are really missing is a very powerful family support that kids in most other families have, like just like by background, by nature. And so really like this very family support is just not there to the same extent for these disadvantaged backgrounds. That's what defines the disadvantaged background. So either the parents cannot or will not support their kids in the same way. So the idea is, could we use mentors or other adults who are willing to help these adolescents do better? And so this is really a program that's aimed at, on average, it's like set up in Germany. It's aimed at 14-year-olds. So it's a very difficult age, but it's basically the age like 1 or 2 years before they actually leave high school in Germany and like have to see what they're doing on the labor market. And the program is there to help them transition into the labor market more successfully. And it's university students who volunteer as mentors for these adolescents. And so they're matched together, and then they usually meet every other week, and then they initially just whatever go to the zoo together or to the cinema, and by they start talking about the future. And the idea of the program is that these mentors actually take the perspectives of these adolescents, so they don't come up with an idea of what they should be doing, but the other way around. What are you interested in? What could motivate you? Turns out that most of these kids have never really thought about that labor market will be there anytime soon, and start with that and help them then finding ways successfully into the labor market. And so my question, like I was really interested to see, can such programs have an impact? So the point is that these kids, these are really, really disadvantaged kids. They are like in very poor neighborhoods, in very bad schools, and schools have given up on them. Probably like partly rightly so. It's kind of, it seems like teachers don't reach them anymore. And then the question, what can we do? So probably it's not everything that we can achieve there has to come from schools. Can we achieve something with these mentoring programs? And so to see whether this can make a difference, we actually set up a pretty large, or whatever it's large, but an RCT. So we actually did persuade them that the only way to really fully evaluate whether this program has an effect or not is that we randomly get some people into these programs, whereas others cannot go into the program. There's always many more adolescents that are needy than they can fill slots. And so we persuaded them, to actually get more kids interested, and then we randomize people in and out. And we've been following up on these kids by now for 3 years. So like a big chunk of them by now actually have left school. And what we see, let me actually skip these details. I mean, we initially said we're going to look at 3 types of outcomes that are important predictors of longer run labor market success. The first one is math achievement. This is like measured by grades in school. And what we see is actually 1 year after program start, the kids, and this is only from like for the really disadvantaged half of the program population, we see that the outcomes improve by half a standard deviation, which is just like a bit hard to say what exactly it is, but it's just a huge impact. I mean, for any like very successful programs, you really often get like 0.1 or 0.5% of a standard deviation, but they do very much better, and that keeps out there until they're at the end of school. We had a second dimension, is like a more non-cognitive dimension that's very relevant for long-run outcomes, particularly driven by patients. And we saw a similarly large effect on patients in the first year, and very surprisingly, that effect was totally gone in year 2 and 3. But this third dimension we looked at was like the labor market orientation. That was something that the program found very important. Like, to what extent are these kids actually thinking about the labor market, thinking about their future? And there we see the same positive effect, and if anything, that grows over time even more. So we see very strong positive effects for very disadvantaged kids in this group. We actually see 0 effect for the more advantaged half that we have in our sample. So this program seems to be really working for really disadvantaged children, where family background, that's my interpretation, is lacking. But the point is not at all hopeless, actually. It really depends a little bit on how you get at these kids. But if you're successful, it seems like you can really totally change the chances that they have on the labor market, because like 3 years down the road, that's where we currently are. We hope to be able to follow up on these in the future again. But one outcome that's a real outcome that we can observe for them is actually whether they have started an apprenticeship or not. And for kids in Germany that come from these type of schools, that's the one important step to successfully enter the labor market. So it's kind of programs that we don't have here in the US, but it's not academic programs, but vocational programs where you work with a firm and get a 3-year degree usually. And this is super important on the German labor market. So on average, people who have these degrees have an unemployment rate of 2.5%. On average, if you didn't manage to get such a degree, the unemployment rate is above 20%. So this is the really one important step to get into the German labor market. And what we see is that in the control group that didn't go into the mentoring, 27% of the kids 3 years after beginning of this program, and the program ran for a year and sometimes for some of them for 2 years, 27% of them actually have started an apprenticeship, and the treatment effect that we see from this program is 29 percentage points. So it's more than doubling this chance. So this is really the science we have so far is really changing their life chances on a major extent. So there are important impact factors for skill development and life chances that come from outside of school. I think that's one of the most important takeaways here. Final thing very quickly, because we talked a lot about adolescents, schools, but skills, of course, I mean, we talked about this, are very relevant in the labor market, and we know very little about what happens with skills when people age. And that's like really our most recent work that we've done in here. So it's super interesting and much more positive than some of the other aspects we've been talking about. So let me quickly raise this. What I thought we knew so far about like how skills change with age comes from these pictures. So this is from the PIAC, the stuff that I showed you, this adult achievement tests, where you just have representative people taking a literacy and a numeracy test, and then you can just look at how they're doing. And this is just the average across all OECD countries. It looks very similar in nearly all of these countries. It's really a picture of decline starting from the late 20s or early 30s. So it's kind of this bit flat here. And then it's people like, the older you are, the worse you do on these tests. And that's what I knew until we started our project about how age affects skills. But of course, the problem with this is, as anybody working quantitatively would immediately realize, is this could be age effects, but could be cohort effects as well. Meaning, like, just these people are older, but they like went through different school systems when they were younger. It could just be that they actually had different achievement 10 years ago than the 10 years younger have today. So this, like, you can always mingle these differences between whether these cohorts actually have been doing differently or whether it's an age effect. Now, the really cool thing is that of all countries, Germany actually did go to the same people who took the PIAC test in the first time and retested them between 3 and 4 years later. So for each person who took the PIAC test initially, we know how this person has been doing 3 to 4 years later. And from that, we actually can now actually see actual age skill profiles, in the sense that we can actually see how much gain or loss is there for 30-year-olds, for 40-year-olds, for 50-year-olds. And what we get there is, I mean, first of all, the picture here below, this is the zero line, and this is how much on average they gained on average for 1 year. And so people in their 20s, actually, they all literally do better 3 years later than they did initially. Gets at 0 around 45, and in literacy, it hardly goes negative. In math, it does go a bit more negative. So if you just accumulate this over age, you get these true age skill profiles. What they tell you is that your literacy and numeracy scores keep increasing until the mid-40s. And then it goes down a little bit in literacy, and it goes down much more strongly in numeracy, although it doesn't go below the levels that you have at age 25. So it's a much more positive picture. It seems that we don't get dumber all the time, although I'm already on this declining parity here. There's like a second main finding we have in this paper, and that makes even the picture for me even look slightly better. So what PIAC has is very rich information about how often and how much people are using these type of skills, both at home and on the workplace. So they, for example, ask people, how often would you read an email? How often do you read texts? How often do you read memos? Or how often do you use a calculator or some other math things? And so we just do an indicator from that, like, and subdivide the population by the median, and people who on average use literacy or numeracy often and not so often. And so these are not very specific rules. It's half the population. We just represented a sample, half the population. And if you subdivide the pictures like this, the red ones is the high users and the blue ones are the low users. And for like the average, like for the half part of the population that regularly uses literacy skills, if anything, it keeps going upwards until 65, and that's as far as we can go with the data. It will be interesting to see it beyond that, but it's not there. And the same is true in numeracy, and it's really, decline is only there and much earlier than for people who don't use it. So the main message here is use it or lose it. So another way to really think about making sure that people maintain the skills when they're in the workforce is to make sure that people are keep on using these skills a lot. That is an important additional factor for skill development. With that, let me conclude very quickly. 7 pieces of evidence I've been showing you. So these basic educational achievements that we can measure with international student achievement tests seem to be the knowledge capital of our nations that are really the basis for our economic prosperity, but also individually, these type of skills pay off quite substantially. The trends in math achievement in the US are pretty alarming. The international picture doesn't give you much hope that just spending more on education and not reforming your system overall will do a lot for improving achievement. What does seem to be relevant are reforms in the areas of exam systems, of testing, particularly standardized testing, and of school autonomy. In addition, these type of mentoring programs that try to help disadvantaged kids very directly, apparently in very disadvantaged situations, can help a lot. And skills do not decline with age for those who use them. Thanks.
Ludger, thank you very much. That was terrific. And I think the slides will be available on the website. Is that True. I think we'll get those up. So yeah, so hopefully people can refer back to those. Maybe just to kick it off and then folks think about questions they may want to ask. The initial slides, you were looking at average scores on international assessments relative to long-term economic growth. Have you looked at sort of different ways of looking at those test data, in particular the distributional effects or the extent to which different distributions of test scores within countries might affect their growth? And I guess what I'm getting at here is you may have some countries where there's a tight distribution around the mean and others where there's a big gap or the big gaps between either end of the distribution. Does that matter, or is the average actually just as good a measure as anything else?
A super good question. So when we looked at that, so if you just take like a measure of the variance or the standard deviation in achievement in a country, that actually doesn't add to the growth projections. So for the growth rates, it really seems to be more the levels. But like another way to look at this is actually then to wonder, so is it particularly that you need very high achievers, so the future rocket scientists, or is it that you need a very good base in the population at large? And that is kind of the same kind of, I mean, there are some countries that are really very good at the top, but doing very poorly on average. And there's countries that have very equal achievement everywhere, but actually may not be as good at the very top. And so what we did is went into the micro data from all these tests and look at the share of kids in these countries that go above a very basic level. So these tests have a 500 mean and a distribution around there. Look at the kids who go above 400, very basic, so basic literacy. And then the share of kids who go above 600, which is really super top performance. And the interesting thing is if you enter these together, I mean, they are of course super highly correlated across countries. Countries on average that do well on the one dimension do also better on the other dimension. So then statistically it's a bit hard to take these two things apart. But if you do it that way, literally both come in highly significantly positive. Meaning, I think that just both things are important. So it's important to have like the super high achievers who actually will create the top new ideas that create growth in the future. But that doesn't help enough if there's nobody else in the population who can use these and put it down on the factory floor. And so both, I think we shouldn't play like the broad average achievement or like the achievement at the bottom against achievement at the top, because it seems that both are important if we want to grow.
Great, really helpful. Marty, you have a question?
Sure. That was a great overview of a lot of research. So, and some of which I had forgotten about, so it was fun to see again. Obviously in the US, a lot of the conversation about achievement recently has been inspired by the COVID learning loss. And you showed in Tim's, and it's also on NAEP, this clear drop in math achievement over the course of in the wake of the disruptions. But if you look at the NAEP data on reading, and I think it's the case also in the PISA data on reading, it's actually hard if you look at the trends over time to sort of pick out the post-COVID time period as one of sort of an unusual trend in achievement, because actually scores peaked around 2015 and have been declining pretty steadily since that time. And I'm curious to know if that is going on in other countries as well. I feel like I've seen some evidence that average PISA scores have been falling over the past decade. And if you have, across countries, and if you have any sense of what could be driving those trends and the potential role of technology.
Now that's really, I do think that this particularly strong decline in math in the US and not so much in reading is very specific, and I really am not quite sure what may be behind that. Can we have the slides again quickly? Sure.
Yeah, in reading, the declines on the NAEP haven't been as
so there is, so I can tell like one, it's very vague, but the main thing is here. So these are the PISA scores. The blue one is the US. It's reading, math, and science. And as you point out, in reading, actually, there's a very small decline only over the passing. This orange one is the average OECD country. And so you see declines everywhere from around the 2010, 2015, here, and here.
Yeah.
But the fact that actually reading is not declining in the US is kind of an outlier.
All right, so I want to revise my question. How would you explain a very different pattern on the PISA test in reading and the NAEP test in reading? That we usually, I mean, because I think in the US picture actually looks like that OECD picture in terms of peaking around 20, depending on the age and the grade. And so it almost looks like there's a measurement issue there, but
yeah, who knows?
and
So,
all right, so
bigger picture.
so here's the question: what do you think is driving the post 2012 declines across countries? And could it be that Jonathan Haidt is right in his social media?
Could be. So I'm very sympathetic to that hypothesis, and I would love to see good research on it. And I haven't seen it because what people, I mean, also like this is huge, like what the stories he's telling is about mental health in particular. And it's just that you can see that mental health issues among adolescents went up around 2009 when social media started to grow. And that's, I think, is very rough evidence. And where do you get exogenous variation and social media exposure? That's a tough question because I think many of the arguments that are made there are very persuasive also to like both in terms of mental health. I can fully see that, but probably anybody who's got teenage kids can see that. And I can also see that this could actually spill over into these academic achievements because I think attention spans of children are getting shorter, and you're always disrupted by that. And I could see that actually has an effect on achievement. Literally, this is just a hypothesis for me, and I haven't seen any. I mean, there's one paper that actually tries to use differential exposure to 3G internet access in different regions of different countries for that. And that is suggestive that actually it could that could at least be related to some decline. But I think that study has many issues as well. And so I find this to be among the most important open research questions at the moment to nail it down, because if that's the case, that would really require important policy regulatory. But that I find, but for that, so that's why I'm really irritated about this. If that's the case, I would particularly expect detrimental trends in reading as opposed to math. I mean, it's going to affect everything, but if you like, one of the things about social media is that people don't read anymore.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, that wouldn't explain to me these things. And I think also in the NAEP, the decline is stronger in math than in reading, or isn't it? So
it depends on whether you're talking about the COVID decline, which is stronger in math because it wasn't trending out, but the reading one really started in 2015. And
so I can tell you that in Germany, we have the same long-term, like Germany was doing very badly initially on PISA, and we were totally surprised. And that actually increased a lot of, as I would interpret it, accountability and interest in educational achievement reforms that like had more testing, but also families were more aware that we should do better on this. So we had an increase until around 2010, 2012. And since then, it's been trending downwards, just as you're saying. And I think part of that in Germany is really that we totally lost focus on the importance of these outcomes, and their basically reforms went the other way again. But it could be that part of that trend is also, and it's actually very similar in the three subjects in Germany. But it could be that part of this is social media.
So other questions?
Okay, thank you. Maybe building off Jim's and Marty's questions, but that will be up to you because maybe they're not connected. So could it be that part of this decline has to do with what maybe, so what you hear people in this country and in many European countries, right, being one of the challenges of education system, which is the increasing complexity of the student population, so more diverse, or sort of disabilities among the students, maybe other things that are catching their attention. And so I guess my question is, do you think that would affect what you what would be drivers of higher average student achievement, for example? Would you expect that to cost more now to achieve the same levels of student achievement that maybe 20 years ago, say, or something, which is what I guess I was getting at, something I'm looking at with Paul, is the increases in different profiles of staff in districts that are kind of going through the roof, right? Like, so hiring more teachers, but also more paraprofessionals, administrators, all kinds of other profiles, which sometimes are justified by what we're dealing with a more complex population than we used to.
So I don't know the details of how measures of socioeconomic background and these things have been trending in the US. I remember that for like at some states but that's actually only until 10 years ago. That's not super interesting. So many people were telling the same stories again, but if you're there, I remember that Rick Henushek and others have done research on it then. If you look at the longer term trends, it's true that more kids were living in single parent families, for example. There's a couple of things that were kind of going in directions that would predict lower student achievement, but there were many other things that go the other way. So on average, parents these days are better educated than 20, 30 years ago. On average, they are richer. It's true, though, that fertility is very different in different groups of the population, and that actually gives rise to actually a somewhat negative trend. But I think I remember that at the time they concluded that on average, if anything, there's probably no huge differences and everything rather slightly positive. No, that could be different now, and I don't know the data for the US, I have to say. For Germany, people have looked into this because, I mean, like other European countries, we've seen huge influx of children with migrant background who would struggle because of that, and even more because they're usually from like relatively poor backgrounds and less educated backgrounds. And so people have done the math basically in looking at what would you expect for in terms of a decline because of that, because I was referring to beforehand, kids' achievement is very strongly associated with these type of background factors. But with these changes that we've seen in Germany, we can roughly only account for maybe a third of the decline in achievement that we've seen over the past 10, 15 years. So it is a factor, but probably not even the bigger factor. So there's other things that have to contribute to it as well. I couldn't tell you the same numbers.
I think we've got a question online. Michael, you want to read it?
Paul, would you like to state your question?
Oh, even better.
Let me see if I can reach you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Paul, hey, good to hear you.
Hey, Ludger, how are you? Nice to see you, at least your image. So I have two questions, very different. So let me ask them both at the same time and you can respond. One is the difference between Latin America and Asia is really striking, and that's really a powerful set of findings there. I always think of Latin America as challenged by the amount of corruption that's been in place in that part of the world for so long. And so I'm wondering if there could be any correlation between the quality of the school system and the corruption that's pervasive in the society, maybe includes the school system, but beyond the school system. You get teachers, I mean, in Mexico, there's extraordinary examples of the way in which teaching assignments are made. So maybe what you're attributing to achievement, there are other things in the society that are correlated. So that's one question. The other one is about the PISA test itself. You're relying quite heavily on PISA, but PISA doesn't correlate with other tests. Marty was suggesting that in his question, I think, but if you sort of look at PISA, you look at PISA has a strategy. They want to be a worldwide testing organization. They want to get all kinds of developing nations to participate in PISA. Have they dumbed down the easy part of the test? That is to say, the low-end questions, the ones that are easy to answer, they made them even easier to answer over time in order to build that constituency. And have they toughened up at the top? So I mean, could some of your findings be driven simply by changes in the design of PISA? So I don't have any evidence that they're doing this, may not even be doing this intentionally. It may be just sort of happening. So I'd love to hear what your comments on that are.
So on the latter one, I think the one thing is you're right that I think PISA is interested in expanding, and I think some things they have done, for example, allowing China to participate only with 2-3 rich provinces is the thing, because every other country really has to participate with representative samples of the entire nation. But in terms of the testing that they are doing, I mean, well, all that I can say is, I mean, they have their tests. They use some of these test items over time, which are the linkage items that allow you to psychometrically link your tests over time, and then the others are scaled towards that. And to the like, I've never heard that the psychometrics in there are fundamentally bad in the direction of like making the tests easier in some dimensions, because it's literally always just scaled again onto the same scale. So I would be surprised that that's something that's fundamentally driving changes in here. But you're right that, well, I mean, if you look at PISA and TIMSS just in the cross-country cross-section, in the way we're looking at it, and people have done a big fuss about these being different tests, because PISA is oriented more to real-world applications and what you need in your life, as opposed to TIMSS is really curriculum-based. Once you look at what are the things that you should have been taught in your school system, so they make a big fuss of these differences. Then if you look at these tests, they are across countries are correlated at 0.94, and that hasn't changed over time. Like, and you can look at any point in time, they literally measure the same things, and in that dimension, I think they are measuring similar things. But you're right that there are some countries for which the trends over time do not look exactly the same, and that is something that I think we need to understand better, and I'm not quite sure where that comes from. I should check into it. So you have information, for example, about test exclusions and these type of things that we've done research on in the past, showing that if countries like exclude more schools or more individuals within schools from test taking, and we have the information on that because that's the setup that they have to do. Then you can look better on the international tests. Luckily, any of the things that I've been showing you in here actually are not at all affected by accounting for that. So these things to be orthogonal to that. But it could be, and I do remember having heard stories that, particularly in PISA, the US have had problems of persuading schools to actually participate. And so it would be super interesting to look more deeply into that, to what extent that could be part of what we're seeing there. But I haven't done that, haven't seen that. The other question you had was about, say, corruption or otherwise, like other things that go on in different countries. And that the one question is that could lie behind the quality of the education in different countries. And the other one is like, to what extent is actually then what we are attributing to better achievement of the population is actually more like other things that go on in these countries. So in the research that we've done there, we looked very deeply into that. And we looked at things like other explanatory factors like geography or fertility or physical capital. Literally all these things didn't enter at all significantly in the growth regressions when you have the test scores in there. The one other thing, and that gives a lot of credence to what you were saying, the one other thing that does enter significantly is the quality of the institutions of the economy or the country overall. So in particular, things like security of property rights are exactly something that mirrors things like corruption and so on. And the other is openness to international trade. So this is a factor that also does predict long-run economic growth. And it also interacts significantly positively with the quality of the education of the population. So what this means is that when you have systems where you can actually economically flourish, you have the freedom to do something that first of all gives you more prosperity, but it also helps you to use your talent in a better way. Or to put it differently, in countries that have very bad institutions where the best way to make money is to rob it from somebody else because you're not going to be persecuted, so there's no security of property rights and so on. the best, you may even think of a better education having a negative impact because you're better robbers. And so there is this positive interaction that you need to have an institutional structure that's working overall, and then education has an even more positive effect. But it's not that like what we're seeing here as an effect of education seems to be just capturing like the quality of the governance in different countries, because once you account for that, actually it hardly reduces the impact of education, but it has a separate independent.
We probably have time for one more question. So you can pick the lucky individual if someone's got a question.
Thanks. Thanks for your presentation. And when you talking about the correlation about centralized exams and the achievements, I got a question about except for like transparency for the results, is that the students who are who have the centralized exam, if they are they having more training to like facing this kind of exam? So like to what extent do you think the strategy of the exam will like affects about the achievements like for their exams like PISA or the other like worldwide exams?
So that's a good question. Of course, if these really are exams that matter a lot, for example, to go get into college and so on, there's of course a lot of incentives then to do well, and then that could induce families to additionally invest into getting better, including like getting private tutorships and so on. I mean, in research, we actually, the data that we have is a little bit about how much you use private tutoring and so on. And if you condition on that, that hardly changes the results on the important effects of exams. But more broadly, at least, like I know that in several Asian countries, that is a huge issue and by now a huge concern, because it could increase inequality a lot if only rich people can like afford additional tutoring, or if that really like makes kids focus only on these outcomes in the end. I think, I mean, there certainly is something that can happen, and you can like go overboard on these things. It seems that overall that's not exactly what we're seeing in the broader sense, and it's actually. So, for example, you could just do these analysis within European countries or just within Asian countries, and you see the same association, because like there's some Asian countries that have exams and some not, and the same within Europe. And so it's not something that's just driven by these like more broadly cultural differences between different regions of the world. It actually does seem to be more closely tied to the exam systems. But I think it's a very interesting and relevant thing to think of.
Well, we're at time. Any closing remarks or observations?
Well, no, thanks so much. Super interesting discussions. Maybe if others have more things to talk about, I'd be happy to talk about it right afterwards here. And thanks for coming.
Sure. Well, thank you very much.